Another theme that runs through the class is the idea of learning and the important role that learning plays in any of the activities we carry out in a professional capacity. And very often when we talk about learning, we focus on the process of acquiring knowledge, of gaining new skills. But in any example of learning, usually there's also a counterpart to that learning, and it is the unlearning of what we did previously in that context. So if you're trying to learn a new skill, or indeed if you're trying to, as it says here, change the way that you do something, before you learn the new thing, you have to unlearn what you already did before. And that's difficult because our brains like to conserve energy. They like to be lazy. So it's easier for our brains to tell us to perform something the way that we did before. It's harder and more sapping on our energy for our brains to try and focus on doing it the new way. So this process of unlearning, trying to erase the code in the algorithm in our head that tells us to do something the way we did it before, is something of a real challenge. And teams go through processes of learning and unlearning as well. So you imagine the complexity of trying to get you as an individual to unlearn something that it knew before, its habitualized behavior. Imagine the complexity of getting a group of people who are operating as a team to unlearn a process that they used to carry out. It's something that any team encounters regularly, and it's a real challenge. It's the thing that the best performing teams do well. And the first step towards that is understanding the process of unlearning and recognizing that it's a really difficult part of the process of learning. In this class, we'll also regularly touch on the idea of failure. Team failure, individual failure. There are all kinds of facets to our understanding of failure. I've got the quote here from Yoda from Star Wars. Don't worry, it's the only time I'm going to expose you to Star Wars. I'm not some kind of secret super fan of Star Wars, but there's this phrase that Yoda in Star Wars uses. He says, "Do or do not, there is no try." That's that weird Yoda speak, but actually, Yoda has a really nice message contained in this phrase. He's referring to failure. When he says do or do not, what he's saying is it's in the context of the story where he's trying to teach Luke Skywalker to use the Force. Now Luke Skywalker says he'll try. Now, the idea of trying relates to the way in which we are orientated towards the concept of failure. If we fear failure, then one of our natural human responses to the fear of failure is to try and almost create an insurance policy about failure. If we recognize failure as something very negative, then when we say we're going to try to do something, what we're doing is we're creating a disclaimer about the fact that we think we might fail, and we don't have the confidence to believe that we might be able to achieve it. That's why when Luke Skywalker says, "I'll try to do it," and Yoda says, "Do or do not, there is no try," what he's saying is, it doesn't matter if you don't manage it, that's just you failing. When you don't, you'll learn what your limit is, you'll learn what your own personal limitations are, and once you've reached your limit, you can start to understand what it is you need to do to start to extend that limit, to try and go beyond your limits, i.e. you've reached the threshold of learning. So failure has a fundamental role to play in our conceptualization of learning, because we can't learn until we recognize where we fail. Very often in life, there's a proportion of us humans who are so scared of failure that we deliberately perform below our threshold of ability because we don't really like to encounter failure. The problem is that these same people are people who fail to grow and fail to learn effectively. The more comfortable you are with the idea that failure is not a negative thing, it's actually part and parcel of the process of learning. The more comfortable you are with that, the more effectively you'll learn and the faster you'll develop. And teams have to adopt a culture of this. Teams have to adopt a culture of being comfortable with the idea of failure. And my favourite example of this, being a massive tennis fan, is when Andy Murray was defeated in the Wimbledon final, and he stood on centre court afterwards and spoke to Sue Barker, and he broke down in tears and he apologised. The reason that's a powerful moment is because that was someone who had tried their very best on the biggest stage, and they had reached their limit. They'd tried everything and they'd failed. And the tears that Andy Murray shed that day, that was someone who was just at their very limit and was quite upset about the fact that they'd found their limit. The response to that was brilliant, because what was the response to it? He came back and won the Olympics and Wimbledon the following year. But what Andy Murray is a good example of in sport is someone who's quite comfortable with failure. He's made failure his friend, and he's applied that cycle that you see on the bottom right. Try, fail, go through that as many times as you want. Eventually it will lead to success.